So what we have here is a simple separated scene from our main master scene, and I'm just going to use this as an example for compositing. What I have is just toon shaders on these really interesting objects created by Credit, and I've added a grease pencil line art to this. And this is partly because I want line art to be in my scene, but I'm not really super jazzed about the amount of complexity on the master scene. So I just want this line art to be applied to these objects, which I'm going to position in the background actually. What we can do is have this as a separate scene, and we'll composite it into the other scene as well. But to do that, first, let's just play around with the compositor itself. I have this grease pencil object in, but I'm going to actually hide it from the viewport and swap off of render view just so this goes a little bit quicker. And I'm going to hop into the compositing tab. And here you can see this black preview, this kind of blurred preview from one of my tests. But what you want to do is click Use Nodes here in the compositor. And that will swap it to a node system like you're familiar with the geometry nodes and the shader nodes and all of these other Blender systems. But of course, within the compositing set, these are going to be different nodes. One of the most important ones we want is a render layers node. And the render layers node is essentially telling us what is going to be rendered out. By default, if we go into our view layer properties, we can have all of these different layers set on for rendering. And these immediately come in as inputs here that we can play with. If we search up a composite node and we plug in image into image and we hit render, we should have no surprises. When we hit the render button on our render preview, our scene comes up as we expect it to. You'll notice that this background is still gunked up, and that's because we need actually a viewer node. So we'd search up a viewer node, and the viewer node is going to be our preview for what's in the background. Here it's not perfect because it's going to be behind our nodes here, but it's still really handy to have as a live preview. It's important to note that the viewer and the compositor are super different. If, for example, we only have things plugged into the viewer and we hit render, actually nothing is going to be rendered because nothing is getting linked into the final composite. You need to have actually both, and what I would recommend is you search up a reroute node, and you can plug it in to your composite, and then what you can do is route that here. So now anything you plug into this reroute will go into both. So that way you can have a live preview and you can have it outputting to your final render as well. You may be thinking, wow, this is just rendering with extra steps, which it is. But the reason you want to render with extra steps is because you can put stuff in between. And one such example will be a distortion node. And this is one of my favorite effects that you can apply in rendering, and I think you guys will quite like it as well. And it's called lens distortion. And if we plug it in, the default settings are set to 0, but what we're going to add is some dispersion. And what that does is it replicates an old film effect which was based off of the spherical lenses of cameras, where when the lens is curved, it separates the colors of light around the edges. You can make this very extreme very quickly by changing these numbers and get some really wild effects. And this is a preview for what it would be like if you were to hit render. So actually, if I do hit render, you'll notice it renders the image and then it applies the effects on top of that. That's exactly what's happening here in the composite setup. And you, of course, could now also render out your animation, and this effect and filter would be applied to the entire animation. Where this starts to get very interesting for us is we can actually animate these properties as well. We'll start this back at 0, and if I mouse over the property and I press the I key, I have now keyframed that value. So if we jump to the end of our sequence at frame 400 and increase this to 0.6 and press I again, now we have keyframed that dispersion effect over time. Now, in this preview, it's still showing the first frame of the animation, even though the timeline is changing, and that's just because it's not actually rendering out the entire scene. It's just locking into that first preview render that we hit. And it's important to note, to get a preview in here, you have to hit the render image button once, because this is the seed base, and if you don't have this, it just won't include it at all. You need to hit the render button to actually get a preview. But if we just kind of cycle through this, you'll see that this effect is going to become more and more extreme on this set as we go. And if we want to, we can actually go ahead and render out a quick preview of this. I will actually do that, a short amount of it, or I already have done this actually. If I go into here and I double click on my video, you can see that I had this set up and I just rendered it out with this dispersion effect, which is added as a filter over the video. Looks pretty nice. So what we're going to do next, though, is combine this with our other scene. And to do so, what we'll do is we will add another render layers. And what we'll do though is change it to scene 1. Now, we of course could have it so that this dispersion or this lens distortion is affecting both of those scenes, but let's try it where we're just combining the first over top of this one. And I actually have the first scene set up with a transparent background as well to make this even easier. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mix node, and I'm going to plug in this to image 1 and this to image 2, and let's hit render image. And you'll notice that here the preview isn't going to be complete because I'm not routing my node in. So here what we need to do is we'll cancel that render. So what we have to do is make sure we route this here into our viewer node. So this is showing it a preview of how it's going to be combining these. So once you've rendered that out, you'll notice that it seems like nothing has really happened, but if we click this button here, it will start to use the alpha of this second layer. So actually now it is combining them, and we would be able to render this out as an animation. And what I'm actually going to do is I'll just jump back a bit and I'll render another frame out, and we can start to get a sense of how this is going to be coming together. So it's rendering this scene as the foreground, and now it's also simultaneously rendering this scene as the background. So after some experimentation, I landed on a 3-layer system, which has a foreground, which is just a layer of bridge geometry, and a midground, which is the bridge area where the character is running, along with a few buildings and actually this sun blob. And then I have a 3rd layer, which are the line drawings. And I could have been a bit more precise with which layer went into which scene setup. For example, in this version, this sun is actually going to be in front of these objects, which at certain points may feel a little uncomfortable, but I think it'll make still for an interesting video clip. I have them layered using the mix nodes, as you see here. This foreground layer is actually the bottom, and then the things behind it are layered in above. And then I would recommend, if you want to put filters over the scene, you put them at the end, actually, after the last mix node, and that will really help tie the layers together and make them feel like they are all as one scene. And as you're going, you might want to test a lot of this, and if you're ever running into an issue where it's taking a little bit too long to render this, for example, when I was doing it, each frame with the 3 separate layers rendering independently was taking about 15 to 20 seconds to render. And so I rendered out about 100 frames while I ate dinner, and it wasn't even close to being finished just yet. What I could recommend to you is you might have a lower resolution preview. So you might change this percentage to, say, 25%, and then render out a snippet of it, use the DJV player to preview that, and then once you're happy, you crank it back up to full resolution. Now, with things like the grease pencil and the freestyle, those will still take a bit longer. Those are actually the longest layers to render. The rest of them will render much faster in comparison. Just keep that in mind. All in all, though, I really encourage you to just play around with the layering system, and I would recommend having at least 3 layers, but of course you can have as many as you want. Just the more you have, the more depth you're seeing.